I now make less money than I could. I now have less social cachet if I go to a group of entrepreneurs. I mean, some people do find it interesting that I optimize my life entirely around surfing. It's like refreshing. But again, like you give up some of the things that are the little safety blankets in social situations if you de emphasize your career. Like surfing was my Zendo, and it took me a long time to accept that like there's something about Mother Ocean that I wanted to keep returning to, and that was teaching me this thing and leading to this inner transformation. And it was almost like a force once identified that I couldn't say no to. I don't think you can really plan your way into this type of life. It was something that happened naturally, and it happened naturally because that's where my like love and energy was going.
Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Remotely Serious. I'm here with Calvin Rosser. He's many things. He is a podcaster that I've been listening to for several years, really, all throughout the pandemic. I got to know you from Shit You Don't Learn in School, your podcast, but I've read some of your written work as well and gotten to know some of your thoughts and thought leadership over the last few years. And really, I think it was 2021, 2022 during some of the tail end of the pandemic. I started listening to the SIDLess, as it's abbreviated in my mind. Calvin, welcome.
Thanks. Glad to be here. And pretty cool to learn that you've been following the work a little bit, even before the stuff with Steph and Lemon Squeezy and Internet Pipes.
I guess it's 2 years before that. I'm trying to remember the timeline. But yeah, you assisted on. I don't know. Actually, I don't want to maximize or minimize your role in Internet Pipes, but you were definitely part of the team. Maybe even leading the team at Internet Pipes, which is a very successful um, course-based, cohort-based, innovative. I'll say education product from Steph Smith. Um, but how would you characterize that one? I don't want to make it about Internet Pipes, but because Steph's not here. But how would you characterize Internet Pipes?
Yeah, I would say it's definitely Steph's brainchild. Steph is my wife, and we often work together on projects. So Internet Pipes is one of them. The podcast is another, and we've done some other courses. But it really is, her way to show people how to use the data on the internet to find business ideas. Uh, you know, vet some of the existing ideas that they have and really scale your business. And I helped her out at the end, and she now calls me a co-founder, but I still very much say it's her project. And I'm here to help where I can for her.
That's great. So people should check that out, and we can put it in the show notes. But the reason I reached out to you, with my role at Lemon Squeezy, we worked together a little bit on getting that launched and getting the payments launched for that. But the reason I reached out to you for this podcast is because I think it was a combination of reading your blog posts and also listening to a Shit You Don't Learn in School episode. I think it was the one where you were discussing whether to live in Encinitas, California or somewhere else. And I kind of got part of that episode was learning how much it was important to you to surf. And just because you don't know me that well, part of my background is like I've been a digital nomad. I don't think as much as you, but I've been places like Costa Rica, Portugal, etc. There's always that temptation to take a surf lesson, style your entire life around surfing, but I've never done that. And getting into that a little bit with yoga and hot yoga, but I've never kind of made a life decision around surfing. And it seems like from that episode, you may have made life decisions around the practice and the pursuit of surfing. So maybe that's a first question. Have you ever characterized a life decision you made as something that's for surfing?
The short answer is yes, but just a quick background. So I grew up in Florida, and I grew up like right in the middle of the state. But some of the happiest moments of my childhood were basically being on the beach. That's where I think almost all of my good memories from that period come from. And so I was very familiar with like beach life, the ocean, and I didn't really surf as a kid. I did have a friend give me a surfboard, and I went out a couple times and just paddled around. But it wasn't until when I was a digital nomad in Nicaragua where I was living in this co-living house, and we all went surfing. Someone taught me. I stood up on my first time. It was exciting. And then I ended up in places like Portugal and Bali, and I kind of surfed here and there. But I took a vacation to the Azores Islands, I think in 2019, and it was like a shift in my life, if you will. I was rethinking like what do I want out of my career, my relationships, etc. And I just spent the week surfing with this guy Appa, who was a surf coach there. And something I was having a lot of fun, but something was a big unlock from what he said, which is like, hey man, like if you really want to learn how to surf, you need to go somewhere and live there for a year and just surf every day, and then you'll even know what it means to like start surfing. Um, and I actually took that advice, and I ended up looking up like best surf towns in the U.S., and Encinitas was one of them. I stopped over there, and I kind of fell in love with the place. And then a few months later, me and Steph moved there, um, a 2 minute walk from a surf break. And from that point onwards, it's been 4 or 5 years since then, and surfing has like slowly taken over all pieces of my life, which we can get into. But I really fell in love with the sport and got the bug and made it a very big part of how I think about everything.
And in retrospect now, do you feel that advice is correct? You have to style your life around it or orient your life around it. Can someone get value out of surfing or good value out of surfing by doing it once every 2 weeks on Sunday morning and balancing it with other things and not getting obsessed with it? Can they still become a good surfer? Can they still get something out of it? Or is it true that you kind of need to move somewhere like and get your whole life around it?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you want to be a good surfer, it's the learning curve for surfing. And one of the reasons I find it very interesting, both like as a fun activity, but an intellectual practice, is it's a really steep learning curve. It's a lot more like golf than it is skiing, where golf,
What do
to
you
get
mean by that?
so to become a good golfer, I mean, most golfers are terrible. And in
Mm-hmm.
part, that's because it's a difficult sport. But like to go from beginner or even intermediate to something that you consider good, you have to like basically practice almost every day. I grew up golfing, and so pretty familiar with that sport. Whereas skiing, I picked it up when I was 25. And by the end of my first season, just a couple months of skiing, I was going down double blacks pretty comfortably. And I felt like that was a pretty easy thing to pick up. Whereas surfing, I think to become actually good at the sport is almost like a lifelong practice, and it's extremely difficult if you learn as an adult and you didn't pick it up as a kid because you don't have those skills. But I mean, to your question, like you can get value out of just entering the ocean. You don't have to be like a great surfer, but some people do get the bug. And I think if you really want to take it to the next level, you do have to start making like your life choices in terms of where you live and stop dabbling. And even, I've made my work choices around availability when the waves are good, because the ocean's a dynamic place. Surfing is not like, an indoor rock climbing wall where you can just go whenever you want. There might be like a 2 hour window a couple times a week where it's good, and it's a great time to get out there. And you almost need to be able to jump on that and can't be burdened by, say, like work calls or like inflexibility in your life if you really want to take it seriously, which I don't think you have to get value out of the sport.
Yeah, I want to talk about surfing itself, but I'm still really curious about the overall decision. When you sorry, which city or what place were you in when you fully committed to orienting your life around kind of climbing that hill to learn to surf
It
well?
really it really was moving to Encinitas. So as I mentioned,
Okay.
like I was a digital nomad for 4 years, and I went to like 40 countries, and many of those places I did go surfing, but it still very much felt like what you were talking about, which is going every now and then. I wasn't really progressing. It was still fun, and I felt like there was something there that I wanted to explore. And so I wanted to take this surf coach's advice and be like, okay, if I do this for a year, which is not like a crazy commitment, and it was also me settling down from the nomad life, like this might be a good way to spend my time, and we'll see if I like this thing. And over the course of that year, I think it became clear to me like how difficult it is to move up that learning curve and like what it requires, but also how much I actually love this activity. Um, and I guess if there's any advice there, you either kind of get the bug or you don't. And if you get the bug, then slowly your life kind of moves toward that versus some like big grand architected plan to become a surfer. For me now, it's where my energy flows. And of all the things I could do on a given day, it's the one where I have the most fun and I find the most interesting. So it's like a pretty obvious decision for me to go do.
With that, so in California, Encinitas, that's SoCal, right? We would call it, or is it
Yeah. And
halfway up or something?
Encinitas is 30 minutes north of San Diego, so it's very much
Okay.
the San Diego
Yeah.
area. And now we actually live in San Francisco, where there's still surfing as well, but um, there's other things too.
So in Encinitas, when you made this decision and you were surfing, did you feel like you had to subtract something else? Because I think one of the things is when anyone decides to learn something, it's almost never the hard part isn't just, well, I'm going to do it. I'm going to make time for it and I'm just going to have the discipline to do it. The reality of being an adult is not just sort of the romantic idea as I'm going to work hard. It's making adult choices to subtract something else. So did you feel like there's other sports you didn't play, runs you didn't go on? I was going to learn another language, but I decided not to do that and did surfing instead.
Yeah, the
How did you feel about the time commitment, I guess?
the main thing I gave up eventually, it was like a year or 2 in, but was skiing. That was something I was kind of learning in parallel, and I had
Hmm.
fun, it was social and all of that, but actually the best time for waves is the winter, and that's obviously when you ski as well, and I also think that there's, like, somewhat of a high probability that you get injured skiing, and to me, surfing was just so much more fun and better and something I wanted to do. I was like, "Okay, I'm not gonna ski," despite, many friends being like, hey, come on this trip. And so there was a definitely a social cost. There was the cost of doing that sport. And then I think the more important one though was as I got more into the practice of surfing, trying to be available for those waves, taking trips around it, really allowing it to immerse different parts of my life. What happened was more of actually an interchange of, and it's something I'm writing an essay about now, but I'd say my relationship with ambition changed and
Hmm.
anything kind of work or traditionally career related started to fall in terms of priority for me, and all I wanted was to be able to be like able to go surfing whenever I you know wanted to do that activity. And so I started designing my actual work and life around ultimate flexibility so I could do this sport. And that comes at a big cost of like if you wanted to build a business or be a star employee or do something where you really need to be online all the time.
Hmm.
Eventually I kind of let all of that go, and that was a big, I'd say, change that came from an inner place of, I guess, letting go of external achievements and doing something silly like surfing, which has no no real reward to it other than you're learning a skill. It really is like an inner thing. There's almost nothing to show for the last 5 years of surfing other than like I stayed in shape. I'd say like I'm a little bit happier as a person, but there are no accolades that I can bring to a social setting that's like, hey, look look at where all this effort led me, which is an interesting thing, and I think something uh, that the sport naturally does when people get hooked on it.
Right. So, sorry, are you saying that being really good at surfing isn't something that gives you social accolades, or the opposite?
I mean, people may find it cool if you're a surfer, but in terms of climbing any sort of like ambition ladder, it's
Hmm.
not. Surfers are not traditionally like the most ambitious people. I actually think a lot of surfers are a bit more rogue. They sort of treat work as something that they do to make enough money so that they can take their board out and go have fun in the ocean whenever they want. And you see that's a more common thing of like the average surfer. Whereas there are hyper ambitious people who do surf from time to time. Maybe they learned as a kid, but I almost feel like the sport itself is almost fundamentally at odds with classic um, ambition.
Yeah, I'm just wondering. That kind of brings up the question for me. Then, is there a surfing subculture when you went out and did this often? 5 days a week, all the time. Do you develop social relationships with other surfers? It's like here it is, 6 a.m. again. I'm seeing the same person again, or does it feel like kind of going for a run and coming home? I didn't really talk to anyone. It's a solo adventure. What's the social aspect of it?
It's you do see the same faces, especially if you're going to the same breaks. And sometimes you might make casual conversation, but surfing is somewhat interesting in that I think for a lot of people, it's a bit of a spiritual practice. It's like your alone time. There's not a lot of chatter in the ocean. If the waves are big, I mean, you're hyper focused on, catching them and survival. It's like an all consuming thing. And so you're not out there having like deep philosophical conversations. I have, since moving to San Francisco, developed a more, I'd say, social surf life where I have friends who I take trips with to different places or I surf more frequently with them. But for most of the time in Encinitas, I would say I was like a little bit of a solo cat. I would go out there, I would do my thing. Um, you get like a little bit of a head nod or you say, how were the waves? Oh, it was a good time. It's really kind of a simple solitary thing. I'm sure other people have different experiences, but there there definitely isn't the same kind of social thing as going like on a running club where afterwards maybe you get some like pastries or coffee or something like that. That at least hasn't been my experience.
That's interesting. I would have thought maybe from being a non-surfer at these towns that there's kind of like the Costa Rican surf bar place that everyone goes to, the après surf. Um, maybe surfers aren't drinking as much, but
Yeah.
just some kind of watering hole that people go to. But it's more. Would you say more solo than, let's say, a skiing trip or snowboarding or skiing?
That's been my experience, and I think part of that is actually, it's a practical thing. So let's say there's like a 1 hour window where I see the waves are good. I'm like got my eye on them. Well, I'll text my buddies. I'll be like, "Hey, can you come surfing?" But if they can't come within like 5 minutes, I'm just going
Yeah.
solo, and it's a totally fine sport to do in that way. And so I think it does lead to a little bit more of a rogue solo nature. That said, like I mean, there is like a social element to the people who are also very interested in it. Like we talk about all of the fine details that would just bore everyone else to tears. You know, the contours of this 3 foot wave, or like these board shapes, or all the weird things that you get into if you're really into any sporting subculture that to people who are not involved in it are just probably excruciatingly boring.
When surfing bears out that pragmatism as a personality trait to go and get the wave if you need it, regardless of any social harmony, do you feel like that kind of um, alignment with what needs to be done filters or manifests itself in other areas? An example would be like, are you the kind of traveler who's, let's say you're with 3 or 4 people, you know, a couple of partners or just 4 friends or whatever it is. And I've seen this before where there's like a day, let's just say a day in Budapest, a day in Paris, and some people are like, what are we all doing together all day? What are we going to do from the moment we wake up until we all go to dinner together? And then what are we doing in the evening? And then some people are like, well, you want to do this and I want to do this over here. So why don't we just go do different things that meet our interests and then meet up later? And it seems like surfing attracts the kind of person who's very willing to just go and do the thing they want to do. There's no need for social harmony. Do you feel like that you see that pattern in other parts of life, or is surfing really kind of its own thing, and you don't necessarily take a surfing personality to other parts of life or aspects of life?
Yeah, I don't know if surfing has changed my personality as it relates to those situations, but I can say, like, as a traveler, I'm comfortable actually traveling alone, which is, I think, one thing. Some people want to have a group and, as you're saying, do everything together. And I'm a little weary of people who to travel with people who take like more traditional vacations where everything is mapped out. I actually kind of like to book like the skeleton of travel. Like I know my flight, maybe where I'm staying, but leave a lot of room for like serendipity of what I want to do in a given time or what other people might want to do. And I don't look up a lot of photos. Like I kind of want to be surprised when I go to a place. An example would be like, you know, people are at restaurants and they're on Instagram looking at all the dishes, and I kind of just want to like look at the words on the menu and see what calls to me and be surprised or disappointed by what I choose. And so some of it actually comes down to, I don't think it stems from surfing, but you know, when you digital nomad around for a long time, you learn the types of people that you want to travel with. And I like people who are kind of chill and flexible, and they can go off on their own. I can go off on my own. And no, we definitely don't need to spend all day together if there's, you know, our interests are departing, and we can kind of come back together and share stories.
Yeah, makes sense. I'm thinking about again, this is me as an outsider. So there's a few questions that have come up that I want to ask you sort of more about general life, but still on surfing, the topic of this episode, surfing with Curtis Duggan and Calvin Rosser. The To me there are these different um achievements, maybe, or milestones along the way. Maybe the surfers would say, hey, no, it's like yoga, whatever position you can get to is where you is fine, you know. But I do see that there are these certain milestones that you could get to, and there's almost like getting in the water and staying in the water as a beginner without drowning. You know, that's maybe the
Yeah.
first step one.
Step one,
Be
don't die.
comfortable 30 meters out in the water. And then there's a step two of kind of like getting on the board on your knees. Another step of being like standing up for 1 second without falling, standing up for more than that. And then, you know, it could be a continuum, it could be these discrete steps, but let's just say that there's these kind of achievements, um, just like there might be achievements in weightlifting. Um, do you feel that way? Like surfing is something where you're trying to achieve another goal? I definitely hear you use terms like spiritual. It's kind of about the whole process, not about, it's the journey, not the destination. But did you feel like, well, maybe first of all, is there something neurological or spiritual going on that's different, like a switch flips the first time you're on the board for 10 seconds, and then maybe the first time you do something with a turn or maneuvering a wave for like 30 seconds? Do you feel like a drug hits your brain? What's the experience of getting better at surfing like?
Yeah, well, I like to compare surfing to like a heroin addiction because I'm pretty sure a bunch of dopamine floods your brain at all of
Hmm.
these different inflection points. And if you hear, especially people who learned as a kid or professional surfers, they all talk about that moment they first felt the glide of the energy of the ocean pushing them forward. They may have been on their belly with their parents, or maybe they were standing up on their first unbroken wave. And that seems to be kind of like that first hit of a drug that is extremely powerful, where something about it really connects with you. Um, I think many people have that experience on their first like unbroken wave. So the traditional progression would be if you go do a 60 minute or 2 hour surf lesson, uh, they basically just want you to get up on a whitewater wave. So the wave has already broken and there's like a lot of foam of the ocean, and they want to get you to stand up. And so you go home and you're like, I went surfing. I stood up on the board. Now there's a whole nother thing of like you being able to look at an ocean, assess whether you can go out, be on the right board, navigate other people, find an unbroken wave, get up on it. And then as you mentioned, there's turning. Then people start going looking for barrels, which is like when you're actually inside the wave. Then you're looking at maybe I want to surf bigger waves or I want to surf this type of wave. There's all these levels of progression. But I do think the people who get hooked are often, they get that first dopamine hit. And when I think about surfing, like what I think is really interesting about the sport versus other ones is you are you're going out into the ocean and all you're doing is trying to capture, you're like dancing with the ocean. The ocean is providing some sort of energy, often from long like storms or wind, and you are trying to position yourself so that you're capturing some part of that natural energy that's flowing that eventually breaks and goes onto the beach. And so, unlike, say, weightlifting where you're generating the motion, in this case, you're actually finding the energy that's already there and you're dancing with it in this kind of rhythmic way. And a lot of good surfing looks effortless. And it's because people know how to harness the energy of this wave, which is a very difficult thing to learn how to do. And that is what a lot of time in the water and time spent surfing ultimately gets you to. And that's very magical because it's it's like this brief impermanent moment created by nature and this like beast of a force that's way more powerful than you, and you just get to be a part of it for a small moment. And I think people get really hooked to that, and that's very unique. It's even unique versus skiing down a mountain, which can be dynamic. You can have like whiteouts or you can have icy conditions, but the mountain really isn't moving. The ocean is moving and you're just trying to move with it in a graceful way.
Have you ever taught surfing?
I've taken some people out. Yeah.
Yeah.
And actually, interestingly, when you learn as a kid, like when you ask a good surfer, "What are you doing?" Most of them, unless they're professionals, like they have no idea how to teach you, especially if they learned as a kid. And I think one of the big gaps in surfing, uh, where I've wasted a lot of energy cycles or probably not progressed as fast as possible, is like there are these intro lessons where you learn how to stand up on a board. There are surf camps where you can like learn to improve, but going from like beginner, intermediate to advanced is this like long, long journey where it's very difficult to figure out how to do that correctly. So as I've been learning, like I've been thinking about, what are the things that would have made this way easier? An example is I never did snowboarding or skateboarding, so I'm not good at board sports, or I had no experience with them. And surfing, like you probably spend 1 to 2% of your time actually riding the wave. So much of the time is like looking for waves, paddling, jockeying, and lineups, all the stuff that has nothing to do with like the cool, you know, pictures or videos you might see of someone on a board doing cool things on a wave. It's such a small part of the sport. And so as I got better at, say, paddling or reading the ocean or all these other skills that go into being a good surfer, being able to catch a wave, I noticed that like my board riding skills were actually behind, and that's because so much little time was there. So I got this little skateboard. It's called a surf skate, and it's designed where the wheels are really loose, and you actually can move around on a skateboard like the surfboard. And a skateboard, unlike surfing, you can spend a lot of time on the board. I can just go out into the street outside my house, which I do almost every day. And in fact, I did before this call. And suddenly, the amount of time I'm spending on a board and my comfort on a board riding skill perspective is way better. And I wish I had gotten a surf skate not 2 years in, but right at the beginning, because it would have made everything about my progression easier. And there's a lot of things like that where I think when you're learning as an adult, you can kind of break the skill down into how can you get better as quickly as possible and start having a lot of fun out there in the way that everyone wants to do.
So do you think that typical intro to surfing lesson that many have maybe seen or seen someone do, which is about getting a quick win, going out on the sand, doing this, and then 5 minutes later they're pulling the board into the ocean and they're holding the board for you and then turning it around. Is there some better version of that where it's like a surf camp where you don't even go to the beach for the first 2 weeks because you're skateboarding? Or if you could reimagine surf learning to surf from scratch, you might do things differently. Like, is that intro to surf lesson really just a pragmatic tourist business, or is it actually a good pedagogical way to start your first day in and of itself, regardless of like trying to get $70 off a tourist?
Yeah. I think it's definitely it's a part of learning how to surf, but I think it gives people the illusion that they can surf. And just to give you an example, like I think a lot of people do the intro surf lesson, maybe they do too, and then they rent a board and they try to go out on their own and figure it out, and they realize they have no idea what they're doing, and they get themselves into dangerous situations. They put other people in danger, and they really don't know what is it that I'm not doing that was different about this lesson. So I think the lesson makes sense given that people they're on vacation, they want to spend one day surfing, they want to feel good about it. So that structure is correct. But actually, something Appa, this guy in the Solace Islands, did for me is before we went out in the ocean, and this is when I had already surfed a few times, he opened up a book of waves. And he's like, okay, first thing is you need to be able to like figure out like, what is this wave doing? And he's like, do you go right or do you go left on this wave? Because if you think about surfing, you're not going straight. You're actually riding either to the left or to the right to catch to be on the unbroken part of the wave. And so he shows me the book, and we're doing it while we're looking at the ocean. And then he's like, "All right, now look at the ocean." And he points somewhere. He's like, "Left or right?" And I had to be really quick. He was like my little guru, uh, um, and that was actually really helpful because I started thinking in my brain like, "Oh yeah, you go like left and right on a wave." It's like really obvious stuff, but
Mm-hmm.
they don't really teach you that in the surf lesson, and that's partially because you're riding broken waves, so you do just kind of go straight, but it's those little pieces. And then maybe you would do like, I don't know, 3 days in the ocean. And then we get on the skateboard and we film that and we see how you move on the board. Are you really stiff in your hips? Like, do you need to loosen up? Are you looking down instead of looking where you want to go? There's all these like surfing specific things that uh, are, probably don't make sense to the non surfer, but where I think I probably could compress what I've learned in 5 years into 2 years or less with the right training.
What you're describing around like that how to get from intermediate to hard, I feel like that's a generalizable problem, which is
Mhm.
that it's like coding boot camps. There's so many that can help you learn HTML, CSS, and JS and make a rock paper scissors and a to do and a directory app and all this kind of stuff. But all that long journey around like how do I make a full app that has authorization and scale up the servers and make the database not just simple but complicated is this thing that there's not that many boot camps, and most of the learning does come from being in a company or being an indie maker who takes has a huge problem one evening when everything blows up, and then they lose a bunch of money and they have the scars. And I didn't do my database right, and then that's how I learned to do it properly over years and years and years. Um, so I wonder if there's like this kind of cohort based like year long surf camp that obviously would be very difficult to like you can't just charge. I mean, maybe for the super wealthy you could charge 100 grand and have them live and surf with a surf instructor, but that's kind of a premium product. But it makes me wonder, in this space around like getting from intermediate to advanced, is there some way to turn that into a product? Like, and not to be crass about it, but do you think that there's any way to help with that second much longer journey of getting from intermediate to advanced, or even from sort of super beginner to intermediate for a surfer?
100%. I mean, there are two products that exist. One is like a surf camp, and so I have a buddy who's an intermediate surfer, and he's going to something called Surf Simply in Costa Rica. It's I think 10K for 1 week. It's like a very
Hmm.
bougie surf camp, which is that's expensive, right? Um, but they have like professional level instruction where they video you twice a day. They have
Hmm.
some sort of philosophy, kind of like I'm describing. Oh, you get on the surf skate. They have their own philosophy around how to learn how to surf. And I honestly think you could, uh, I could flail around for 2 years doing the wrong thing, or I could go to this camp and actually learn how to do it correctly, and just change the trajectory of my learning curve entirely. And so some of it would actually be on you to, in fact, I should probably do this. Like, I'm still not an advanced surfer. Like, go to one of these camps, be like, oh wow, this thing I just keep doing wrong and wrong and wrong. That's the problem with it, is you can just keep doing the wrong thing and plateau. So that's one thing. And then there are surf products. There's two that I know of that are apps, and
Hmm.
they cover things like surf skating. They teach you kind of like land based things to learn how to surf as well that you go apply on your own. And then there's like flexibility and mobility and surf strength, because that's another big piece of the sport as well, which is, to stay healthy as a surfer, you really need to learn how to like take care of your body in this way, that this very specific sport where you're paddling a lot and getting thrown around, where your body is strong enough and able to, um, you know, deal with what it needs to in the ocean. And that was a problem for me for the first 3 years, is I had like neck and lower back problems. And some of it was just like little changes that I made in my workout routines, and things I needed to learn about my body so that I could be healthy as a surfer. So those products definitely exist. Um, but when you're first starting out and learning, I think the gap is knowing how to tap into that, like
Hmm.
knowing where to start, or that you should even consider some of these things instead of just continuing to go out on your own and moving so slowly and being frustrated that you're not getting to where you want to go.
In the episode of shit you don't learn in school, where you talk about deciding where to live and going to Encinitas, it's a really interesting episode. I mentioned it already, but I think people should check it out. In that decision making, did you ever consider? I mean, Southern California is a surf place, so it's surf. That makes sense. But did you, in that decision making process, did you ever consider like one of the options being Costa Rica, or I'm literally going to live not just in Southern California where surfing is around, but a surf village, literally a place that is only about surfing for some amount of time. Did that ever come up like as a possibility for where you would want to actually live? Obviously
I'm
sacrificing some other things that are nice amenities in California to live in,
Yeah,
like Nicoya Peninsula or something.
right. Um, well, I will say I think Encinitas is actually pretty close to a surf village, and it's one of the reasons we left, because my wife Steph, she wanted more ambitious people around. She didn't want a town
Right.
designed around surfing. But Um, on the location decision, a big piece for me was I had nomaded for 4 years, and I wanted a place where I could actually settle down and create roots. And I wanted
Mm-hmm.
it to be in the U.S. so that I could be close enough to like family and friends, and basically, yeah, I think create a more sense of groundedness in my life. Now, I think if you wanted to fully optimize for surfing, honestly, I would probably go to like Nosara in Costa Rica. It's a place where there's like consistent waves. There's a good surf culture. It's honestly not that that affordable. It's
No.
low key kind of
Yeah.
expensive there. Um, but in a place like that, you don't have to worry about great white sharks. You don't have to wear a hooded wetsuit. Like I'm going out surfing now and it's like 50 degrees. The water's 50 degrees. People are kind of ornery. It's early in the morning. You go out in Costa Rica, it's 6 a.m. and it's still 85 degrees. You're just in board shorts. Like basically, I would minimize the variables and the friction that's required for me to get into the ocean if I was like trying to maximize that entirely. Um, had I picked it up, I think 2 years earlier, I probably would have been in Costa Rica, and some of the places that me and Steph went to, like Bali and Portugal, etc., were somewhat optimized around like surf life, but we never lived there kind of like long enough to, I'd say, implement the vision that you're talking about.
Yeah. I'm just thinking about what you're saying. Playa Guiones in Nosar, where I've been there, and just like if you're there in the morning and you're kind of walking down, and it's like this beach has 350 of days of perfect surfing weather all year round, and I'm like, wow, this is different than some the south of Spain or some parts of California or other beach places, and it certainly does attract rich gringos that come down and
Yeah.
have a lot of money, and so it is this tension between like, wow, this beach is paradise, but also, oh, where the power went out, and so you can't really have a reliable like remote work life right there, and there's certain things about being down the end of a dirt road that's sort of 4 hours from quote, not literally a Walmart, but something like that, as a North American reference. Oh, we need to get this from San Jose. That's a whole different story. So I could see why people live in Nosara. I can see why people don't live in Nosara. Maybe that's a good question. Like, if someone were, I'll just take myself. I'll sort of make it personal. If I was gonna say this December, January, I know that's winter time in the northern hemisphere, but so you can pick a different month if you want. Um, I'm gonna go remote. I'm gonna do 90 days that aren't in. I'm in Canada, so I'm gonna do 90 days that aren't in Canada, and I would like to, this time, instead of optimizing for something else like learning Spanish or just focusing on work, I am going to take the steps to try and learn to surf practically around the world. Is there a best place to go? Would it be Nosara? Would it be California? Somewhere in Europe? What would you recommend to someone who says, "Okay, I'm ready. I want to do it. I've got 90 days. Tell me what I should do on my workation."
Yeah. So, I mean, interestingly, if you were to think about this from a surfing perspective, so your the timing actually matters. So if it was, let's say it was December through February, in a lot of places in the world, that's like peak surf season. So there's big swells and like bigger waves, and
Mm-hmm.
especially in California, like you actually wouldn't maybe want to be there to learn. And Nosara actually ends up being the perfect place because it's the dry season. It's surfable pretty much every day. It's relatively small, but with enough size. There's good surfing instruction there. There's a good surf culture. It's warm, and I think it's good enough as like a nomad place where like you have some of the internet issues, but you can still make it work. Um, so I would actually choose there. I went there for the first time this December, this last December, and I ended up going back to Nosara and a couple other places in Costa Rica for all of February, in part to do what you're talking about, which is like I felt like in California it was like too inconsistent, and I really wanted to just like make it as easy as possible to surf, be in this like place that's fully optimized for it, where it's warm, and work on some of like the turning and other things that are harder to do on some of the waves here. And yeah, I would totally just go to Nosara if you can afford
Yeah.
it,
Yeah,
or
no,
another.
I think
Yeah,
there are some ways to be, let's just say, more frugal or middle class in Nosara. They're difficult. I can, we can talk about this in a different episode, but there are some ways. But yeah, it's a lot of luxury Airbnbs if you want certain creature comforts. But yeah, for anyone that's listening, this Playa Guiones, to a lesser extent, there's other beaches nearby, but really the expanse of Playa Guiones is a beautiful beach.
I think this will help people a little bit in terms of thinking about surfing. So one thing that also makes that beach good is it's not like a beach filled with a bunch of professional surfers or really angry people, because there's a lot of touristy type people and the beach is big. You have enough space to like kind of go to different sections where there's some more advanced places. There's places for more beginners. It's not really too crowded. And then I think for some reason it's actually a very friendly surf break. And I would
Hmm.
put that in contrast to I've been as part of like thinking about how to progress better. Santa Cruz, which is 2 hours south of where I live now, is a place that has wonderful surfing. It's like part of it's one of the epicenters of like surf culture. The waves are great. However, there's a lot of good surfers and there's a lot of like localism and angry people, and it's very difficult as a beginner to go out there and not get like yelled at or to be able to catch waves because it's so competitive. And so a place like Nosara actually doesn't have that dynamic, and when you're learning, you know, you probably want to go to those friendlier places because then you're going to have less bad experiences, you're going to catch better waves, and then you can kind of learn how to navigate some of these places that you have to tread on water. Because I think one of the things that people don't realize about surfing is they think it's like, oh, aloha, bro, or like it's just totally chill. I mean, people get really angry out there. It's like sometimes it feels like you're in the jungle with other animals who are like trying to get their fix, and uh, you really have to be kind of careful. Like people will literally throw punches and stuff like that, and it's when you're a beginner, you often are ignorant to some of those things, and that can be a little bit of a blissful state too, but you can end up getting in trouble. um, so Costa Rica,
Yeah,
I think, is a good place to avoid that type of thing.
yeah, it feels like with pursuits and hobbies and sports and a bunch of different things. I don't want to oversimplify, but there's kind of like, I've always put things into two categories. And when I was younger, I probably this is just a theory I'm making up right on the spot. But the category one was something like basketball or running. And then category 2 would be like fishing, uh, surfing, maybe mountain hiking for many days. And in category 1, it's kind of like easy to do with very little equipment. Nobody's going to get mad at you if you do it, and it's not dangerous. So you can grab a basketball, wander over to an empty basketball court somewhere, start shooting hoops, and none of those things matter. And what you're describing is sort of category 2, which is, I think, harder. And the three horsemen of the apocalypse are like, one, there's a bunch of business. And I always struggled with this when I was younger. I didn't like things that had a bunch of business. So does someone want to go for like an urban walk in New York, or like a walk through like 6 hours, 8 hours, walk through San Francisco, walk through Vancouver? No problem. I was like really up for category 1. Category 2, and it's like, do you want to do this mountain hike? We need like a backpack that has water that goes to your mouth, and if you may do something wrong, you'll die, and it's dangerous if you don't do this, and we have to be back before the light turns to dark. And it's kind of like, I don't even want to open that box. I want, like, I was attuned to category 1 things. I think I've changed that. I think maybe since the pandemic, something flipped a switch, turning 30, where it's like, I want to get into these category 2 things. And surfing is in this category 2 of, there is a bunch of business, and the people aren't going to be friendly, and they might say you're doing it wrong, and no one's helping you do it. And certain people will say you shouldn't do that, it's dangerous, you might die, a shark might eat your leg. And I think one of the things is in life, and you can tell me, I think you'll agree, but tell me if I've got it a little off, but like, there is something that's even more rewarding about slowly mastering category 2, that if you never open those boxes, you're missing out on one aspect of life where you don't like learn the business, learn the equipment, get over the anxiety about all the mean people, manage the risk and danger, and just sort of, be safe, but don't be totally conservative that you never take a risk. And there's something on the other side of that that's great.
Uh, I mean, I would totally agree. If you can find a category 2 thing that calls to you and that you're willing to make the sacrifices for, it's unbelievably enriching. I mean, I would say it's totally changed my inner landscape. I've had so many profound experiences with nature. The pursuit of mastery and the skill of surfing itself is fun. The way it's changed my relationship with travel. You know, I now travel to surf, and I've ended up in Tofino, Biarritz, certain places in Hawaii, just places I maybe otherwise wouldn't have gone, just because now I'm looking at travel through a surf lens. My relationship with work, my ability to, I don't know, connect with other people, my sense of what impermanence means, and the sacrifice required to get good at a sport. It's really, it's not just true of sports, but if you can find something that just totally engrosses you,
Hmm.
it's an amazing part of the human experience. And for me, it happens to be going out into the ocean on a foam board with fiberglass on it, and to try to capture some of the waves. And some people, they go do surfing or whatever, and it's just not for them. They don't like the ocean. They don't like the risk of sharks. They don't love it enough. They don't love being held underwater. And I think you need to love all of those things for your version of category 2, because in the end, there's a good book about surfing called Saltwater Buddha, and it's about a guy who, he is like a surfing memoir, but he compares surfing to Zen and like his journey within that. And I think one of the things he talks about is surfers have to love paddling, like paddling on the surfboard, because that's like
Hmm.
98% of what you do. And there's an analogy to life where most of life is like the schlep work. Building a business is really cool. It's not all just like making money, getting social status, all of that. Actually, it's all the like, it's hiring people, it's dealing with them, it's dealing with setbacks, it's all that stuff. And you do all that so you can get the 1% to 2% of glory, which in surfing would be actually riding the wave, um, looking back and seeing how far you've progressed, etc. And so there has to be that deep underlying love of almost anything to get to the glorious moments, because most of life is sort of the schlep work, and the same is true of surfing. And he does a beautiful job of kind of talking about that and its relationship with Zen as well.
Yeah, getting close to wrapping up here, but I just was thinking about something you said right at the beginning, which was about how you make choices in life to orient your life around surfing. And I was just curious about if you have any practical advice. If someone, I think people don't talk about this a lot on podcasts, often, at least in the bubble of lifestyle and business podcasts, people often talk about how to find professional success, how to find some work life balance, how to have a morning routine. There's all kinds of things like that. But if someone's identifying something that maybe is not something people talk about a lot publicly, which is, I'm only this ambitious professionally, and I have an a session, a hobby, a sport, a pursuit that I kind of want to put on the pedestal equal or higher than my professional career. Do you have any tips for people who kind of want to do that? If you know, it could be surfing, it could be just, I want to become so good at classical guitar, I want to learn 5 languages fluently, surfing, you know, etc. What they should do, like, what is there certain things you've done? Is it just saying, for surfing, is it just saying, for instance, hey, I'm going to have like a how to work with me manual that says I'm async, or are there certain really specific things you've done
Mm.
to create that environment where you can find your harmony with your pursuit?
Yeah. I mean, there are practical things. So, one would be 3 years ago, I left a full time job. I was working at a venture studio as like a growth marketer, and I have my blog and the podcast and all of that on the side. That's become more of my main thing. Um, but in part, when I did that, like I did not. I've been offered, hey, come be a consultant or do any of these things. I pretty much say no to anything uh, that requires my time and that requires me to be on someone's schedule. This is
Mm-hmm.
one like rare exception. I'm doing this podcast, but I
Oh,
truly
we
like
appreciate it.
I have like 24 hours a day of freedom, and in part that's because like my website. Most of my traffic comes from Google organic search, and so it's like I did some work at some point in the past, and that work continues to pay off for me. And so I kind of think about what I do for work in discrete projects that will pay off over time instead of things that require an ongoing investment. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's like one kind of practical thing. And then I'm not that available. I let my email slip. I don't respond for, I think you DM me and it took me 10, 14 days to respond or something. That's very normal for me because that's like a small ball that I drop to go create this flexibility in my life. And at least for me, it hasn't led to like suboptimal outcomes. I think the challenge that people face when they do this is there are real sacrifices. Like I now make less money than I could. I now have less social cachet if I go to a group of entrepreneurs and talk about what I do. I mean, some people do find it interesting that I optimize my life entirely around surfing. It's like refreshing. But again, like you give up some of the things that are the little safety blankets in social situations if you de emphasize your career. And then the third thing is more like this wasn't some grand plan or choice. This was like, I actually wanted to be an author and write a bunch of books. And my latest essay is about how that plan kind of blew up in my face. And it ended up taking me down like a path where I got very depressed and like I had to come out of that and stuff. And in the end, I actually think why that didn't work at that time, it may, you never know what's going to happen 10 years from now, but it's because a lot of my energy and like what I actually wanted to do was to just putter around, learn how to do this silly sport, and just see where that takes me. Like surfing was my zendo, and it took me a long time to accept that like there's something about Mother Ocean that I wanted to keep returning to, and that was teaching me this thing and leading to this inner transformation. And it was almost like a force once identified that I couldn't say no to. And so the rest of the pieces, kind of fell. And it's a very iterative process. I don't think you can really plan your way into this type of life. It was something that happened naturally, and it happened naturally because that's where my like love and energy was going. And so it became just obvious that I need to protect this thing at all costs. And by the way, I could change my mind 5 years from now. I could have a
Mm-hmm.
child, maybe that becomes the focus of my attention, and suddenly surfing seems like, you know, a hobby that I was really interested in my late 20s, early 30s that gave me a lot for that period, but now I have another focus. And so I guess the last piece of advice if someone wants to do something like that is to not treat decisions as so permanent. Like you could de-emphasize your career for a year to go do that activity that you love, and that probably is going to do nothing in the scale of your life other than just give you a year to like learn and see where that takes you, and you can always go back to what you were doing before.
First of all, that's a great explanation of the psychology of it. And I agree that you should be able to change in a certain amount of years, especially like even what you're saying, kind of almost like the indie maker. I've set my life up so I just get my sort of evergreen projects done, and I don't have to check my email every hour to see if there's a urgent item. But it's possible to sort of discard that identity 3 years from now if a venture firm comes along and says we want to pay you $700,000 a year to be a whatever, like a really high powered person doing deals where it's 10 hours a day of deals and responding within 30 seconds to be professional. I think it's good to be able to have in the back pocket, like, oh, I would turn that on for that era if I needed to do that, and I would discard the sort of indie uh, time preference for a kind of corporate professional, whatever the word is, for sort of fast responding corporate presence, if that was the decision I made. And that's not for everyone. I think people like to have permanent lifelong identities, but I also think that can bite you if you've chosen one and then you need to adapt, and it's just too hard to get rid of a certain identity even though it's not helping you anymore. You can move those levers and sliders around depending on what year it is.
Exactly. Like I think whether it's natural or something I learned or it just resonates with me, but I think I'm willing to discard the piece, like the identity that I used to have, and I'm willing to go through that process. I mean, it almost feels like uh it is kind of a process of inner and outer death that leads to like some grieving. That may sound dramatic about, going from an indie maker to a corporate person, but like it can be that type of experience. And I've been willing to do that because I always feel like the process of doing that and what comes out on the other end, I've never kind of regretted the decisions I've made. It's like very hard to imagine, oh, I regretted spending my late 20s, early 30s surfing, having a lot of fun, being healthy, learning about my body, all this stuff. Like when I think about what my 80-year-old self will care about, I think I probably would more regret actually sitting in front of a computer and not taking care of like my biological needs, also that I can have a little more money in my bank account. And everyone's like, identity stack or preferences are different. And I always go back to like, you just need to be able to like figure out what you want from your own internal perspective and not from what other people really care about. And if you can do that, then all these like other decisions about like how to practically set up your life, I think fall into place a lot easier. And that's always been the way that I do it.
Yeah, well, I think we'll wrap up, and maybe the last question is not about surfing, but it's this is a remote work podcast in theory. It's called Remotely Serious. And one thing I've been looking at, just as an overall like kind of lightning round of one question lightning round, is I've seen a lot in the last year. It might be just sort of the turning of the economy. It's not 2021 anymore. It's not 2018 anymore. And there's a lot of I'll just say digital nomad influencers, or just the vibes on Reddit, the vibes out in the world in real life, of people saying, oh well, digital nomading, I did that for 4 or 5 years or 3 years or 10 years, but I've realized that I want to find a base and I want to settle down. And I'm just curious if you've observed that, is there something inherent, you think, in human psychology that digital nomading is temporary? There are a few people, and especially at the height of the digital nomad craze, it was almost like this is a permanent new way to live. You don't have a home, you move around, and then naturally, and a skeptic or someone from the outside might say, of course, you travel a bit and then you want to settle down. That's a natural human thing. Do you see like the next? I don't know what you're seeing out there, and maybe it's different in San Francisco, but do you think that nomading is something that kind of has a limit on it for 99% of people, or do you think it's going to be something where a subculture of people nomad forever, well into their 40s, 50s, 60s? And what's your sort of take on that, if you have
Hmm.
one?
Yeah, I think, what, like, I think back to my own story is why did I start nomading? I wanted to travel. I wanted to see the world. What happened via that process? I learned about myself. I learned about places I like to live. I found a life partner. I found activities like surfing. I changed my career. There was like a lot of good that came from that. And I basically categorize it as like I figured out more about who I am, what I wanted, and like how to get that. And actually, travel was an amazing vehicle for that because I met all these people. It was really fun, and it kept my brain kind of open and malleable in a way that, say, living in your hometown where you've always been doesn't, because you're not getting exposed to like all these new things that create the new connections. But then why did I stop? Like at some point, what did I want? I wanted deeper connections. I wanted something that was less transient. I wanted some sense of rootedness. There was like a groundlessness to the nomading. I noticed that traveling was like less fun because I had seen a lot of cool things, and suddenly I'm in front of this beautiful mountain, and it's no longer like I'm not impressed by it. And it's like, okay, well then why am I still doing this? And so it was a little bit of just recognizing, oh, maybe this chapter of this nomading thing, full time without a home, is over, and now I want to have some roots. And practically speaking, that was a difficult thing. Um, but over the course of a few years now, I probably still spend 3 to 4 months on the road. And February, all of February, I was in Costa Rica surfing.
Hmm.
So I think I now get the benefit of the rootedness, the friendships that endure, the ability to really get to know a place, and the things that I think humans really gravitate towards in the long run. And you can supplement with travel or other forms of adventure that you're looking for. And I think in the absence of that, you're probably running away from something, uh, you know,
Hmm.
if you just keep moving and moving and moving. And for some subset of people, it actually may be like their deepest path of satisfaction. But to me, it's not. There are trade-offs of being in one place and supplementing with travel. But I really do think the cliche that relationships are all that matter at the end of life is very real, and it's kind of difficult to do that as a nomad. You can
Hmm.
slow mad, return to the same places, and I think that's the most viable path if you want to do it long term. Is these people who they spend 6 months in Bali, 6 months in Portugal, and that is some form of rootedness that still allows for travel. But to just keep wandering, I mean, me and Steph hit 40 plus countries over 4 years. That's too much. Like
Hmm.
it was good for a period, but
Okay, I lied. One last lightning round question,
okay.
and then we'll wrap it up. Um, San Francisco versus the rest of the world. You're in the Bay Area.
Mhm.
Do you find that it's true that the world is decentralizing and you can go be a billion-dollar entrepreneur or just optimize your life the way you want in Lisbon, in Bali, in Dubai, et cetera, Chiang Mai, and San Francisco doesn't matter as much. The downtown's full of homeless people, all of the narratives that are out there. Or do you observe that, hey, Bay Area, it's still like an order of magnitude more of a cluster of ambitious people, and people should come to the Bay Area, and it's just better than all these places? Which way do you see that trend going? Decentralization versus the renaissance of San Francisco and its continued ascendancy over everything else.
Yeah. Well, I will say that I think the trend is towards decentralization. However, I think people overemphasize like how much San Francisco has declined or how much it doesn't matter anymore. And I've actually been surprised living here. We've been here for just over a year, like the number of interesting people I've met and that Steph's been able to meet and who are doing cool things. If you're interested in the traditional kind of career ladder, or even just meeting people thinking differently, like there's the highest density of that here than anywhere else that we've lived. And it's been surprising and enriching. And I've also been surprised that like the homelessness thing and all the narratives there, it's mostly focused on, it's just in this one part of downtown, and I don't ever really go there, so it's not a big part of my life. And I've been surprised how beautiful the city is. There's lots of great places north, south, inland, etc. And it's really like a wonderful place to live in a way that I had visited so many times and I didn't expect. However, I don't think you have to be here to be successful, but I think it can help.
Hmm.
But I will probably always support the nomad version of creating your own life. If you want to be a $1 billion entrepreneur, maybe move to San Francisco. I'm not sure. It's not for me.
Oh, that's a good way to end it, probably. That's a good aphorism to end it on. Calvin, thanks for coming on the Remotely Serious podcast. It's been great talking about surfing and a few other things in the last hour.
Thanks for having me, man. I love to be able to tell the world about surfing, and I could honestly go on for 6 7 hours about it. It's just really lights me up.
We'll do a sequel sometime after you've surfed another year and you've gone from advanced to super advanced, and we'll get even more dispatches from out in the field. Thanks again, Calvin.
Sounds good.